Finally, ladies and gentlemen, that moment has arrived. The first session at the front lawn. We welcome you all again to the 15th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swast, India, at the front lawn. Just for your information, the festival brochure and flyer with all details is available for purchase at the information desk. We are now delighted to introduce River Kings, a new history of Vikings from Scandinavia to the Silk Roads, presented by Hawthornden Literary Retreat. Bioarchaeologist Cat Jarman's investigative historical work, River Kings, the Vikings from Scandinavia to Silk Roads, follows a carnelian bead from the 21st century England to 8th century Baghdad and illuminates a new history of the Vikings. It proves that the Norse warriors had established complex trade networks and traveled much further than originally believed. Her forensic techniques also offer new perspectives of life in the Viking Age and the cultural roles of women and children. And she is in conversation with Festival Co-Director William Dalrymple, and she discusses her innovative approach to the reassessment of writing of a riveting age. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Cat Jarman and William Dalrymple. Cat Jarman is an archaeologist specializing in the Viking Age Europe and bioarchaeology. She directs excavations at numerous sites in England and Ukraine. Jarman also works as a historical consultant and presenter for TV and media and hosts the weekly podcast, Gone Medieval by History Hit. Also, ladies and gentlemen, I have just been told that her book, River Kings, A New History of Vikings from Scandinavia to the Silk Roads, has sold over 50,000 copies. And that is unheard of for a historical academic exercise. Mr. Dalrymple, of course, needs no introduction. He's the festival co-director. And I'm also being informed that these two dignitaries on stage have received the Times History Book of the Year prize consecutively, one after the other, if I'm not wrong. So we have two stalwarts in the field of history, two great historians on stage, and we would like to just welcome them and hand them over the session. Thank you so much.
I reviewed River Kings in the Financial Times when it came out last year. Shame to say I hadn't heard of Cat before that and didn't know what to expect when I got this book to review. And I think I gave it the warmest review I've ever given any book ever. It was an extraordinary tour de force of exactly the sort of thing that doesn't happen enough in Indian history, which is the ability to turn serious first-rate academic research into incredibly exciting, page-turning narrative history, which grips you. It's full of Greek fire, human sacrifice, witches, I mean, anything really that you really want from a good Netflix romp. But it's also a work of very serious archaeology and a work of well, I mean, explaining in incredibly clear terms abstruse matters of carbon-14 dating and how carbon decays over time, and how if you eat shellfish, your dating is different from if you eat pork. Or so, I can't remember the details, but it's an absolute model for anyone who wants to take a PhD and turn it into a best-selling, award-winning history book. And I really cannot recommend it enough. But I should also declare an interest here. Most unexpectedly, Cat and I are linked by a carnelian bead. Because age 17, before I ever came to India, I used to be a very keen student archaeologist and spent all my summers digging on digs. And by 17, I was very interested in early medieval history and got a job on an archaeological site called Repton. And Repton had this dig going on, partly around the church, but I was sent with 4 other diggers under this very eccentric character called Mark Horton, who drove a kind of 3-wheeler Reliance Robin, sort of Tupperware on wheels, wore sort of empire-building shorts, but was an incredibly charismatic figure. And we were digging in the vicar's garden, directly on alignment with the church, a strange mound, and nobody knew what it contained. It turned out to contain a Viking mass grave full of weapons and The bones themselves were fascinating because they were kind of the Viking SAS or special forces equivalent. None of them were under 6 foot tall. They all had these massive frames. And among the many things that we dug but didn't particularly notice and just put in a bag and forgot about that summer was a tiny carnelian bead that, to be honest, I can't remember digging, but may well have dredged up because there were only 4 of us on the site at that point. Years later, Cat, as a Norwegian PhD student, comes on the finds of this dig, which I'm ashamed to say has never been properly written up by the rather hopeless director who directed it, Martin Biddle, and turned her PhD into an extraordinary study of the finds that we dug up 20 years earlier, and realized, actually, I'm not going to spoil the story, but the carnelian bead is the link not only between Cat and me, but also between this whole story of the Vikings and India. So over to you, Cat. She's going to give a presentation for 20 minutes, and then we're going to talk. And the other thing that when I've reviewed this book, it wasn't at all topical. It was very interesting and wonderful, but it was not a topical book. But it tells the story of the origins of Russia and the Ukraine. So we will ask a whole series of questions about an aspect of the book which a year ago had no relevance, but which now is of crucial and central importance given Putin's rewriting of Ukrainian history. So, Kat, over to you, and then we'll go Ukrainian later.
Thank you so much, William. And yes, I can only say thank you again for that review, which I think is a big reason why it did so well in the first place. But it was a very unexpected connection with your link to Repton as well. So what I want to do now, I want to just talk you through, get a sort of whistle-stop tour through the book and through the narrative, through that story, and then we can discuss some of the topics afterwards. And so I'm hoping that you can see it up on the screen. Oh, yes, you can. So I did my PhD on this site, this Repton site, which is very traditional Viking story. So just to sort of definitions here, when we talk about the Vikings, again, which you might be familiar from Netflix or whatever TV shows, we're talking about the people who moved out of Scandinavia, so Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, at the end of the 8th century AD. So traditionally, it starts with a bang in 793 on an attack on an English monastery. Goes on until about 1050, 1066, depending on where you are. And so this Viking Age, really, the discussions are about the people moving out from England, the very traditional raids, and the narratives are very much of the people going west traditionally. We know, as I'll get back to in a moment, that there is a big Eastern element to it as well. But traditionally, they're seen as very separate. We've studied the Viking Age for more than 100 years. It's sort of old news. But what's happened in the last 10 to 20 years is especially new scientific methods. So in the introduction, I was introduced as a bioarchaeologist, which means I study human remains, so looking at skeletons and what they can tell us. And I'll get back to that a bit in a moment. But actually, there's been a complete revolution in what we know about the Vikings. So when I finished my PhD, I wanted to write a book for the general public because I realized there was so much out there and there was so much interest in it. But obviously going to a publisher and saying, I want to write a book about the Vikings when there's hundreds of books about the Vikings out there already, I had to have something new. So what I came across and was this particular bead that William talked. So if you can, the next slide, please. Should be a photo of it here. So there we go. So this bead is about 1 centimeter long. It's made of material carnelian. When I'd worked on the site for already nearly 10 years, I came across this archive, this bead that was hidden away in a Tupperware box for nearly 40 years, completely unremarkable. But I started realizing this bead actually was made most likely in Gujarat in India, and it ended up in this mass grave in the 9th century AD. So the big sort of question then for me was not just how did it manage to travel from India in the 9th century all the way to England, but also why? Why is this trade happening? What are the mechanisms and the networks? And does that actually suggest that these Eastern and Western links are much more developed than we previously thought? Is there much more to the story? What sort of narratives coming now in, when I was writing this in 2019, what new narratives are there? And I also came across a quote or a sort of fact, which was to say that actually more objects of Scandinavian origins have been found in Eastern Europe than in Western Europe. But still our idea, our sense is that the Viking story is very much of going to the west, is going to Britain, Ireland, Greenland, Iceland. But actually you have far, far more objects in places like what's now Russia and Ukraine and so forth. So that really was the starting point. So if I can have the next slide, please. The book basically follows this journey. Can we have the next slide on the screen? No? If anyone's got this. So there should be a map. There we go.
Here we are.
So it might be a bit too small, but if you can see this, this is basically the journey that this bead would have traveled. So these are the networks that I sort of retraced in the book. So it starts up in Britain, goes via Scandinavia and then back eastern rivers and all the way down to Baghdad and then to India. So I'll talk about in a moment. Can the next slide, please, again? So it starts really in this place that the William started excavating 40 years ago and that I've taken up in the last 10 years as well. This is a very traditional story. This is an Anglo-Saxon monastery. We've got these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Vikings, the Scandinavians come, start raiding traditionally. The first recorded raid is in 793 AD. And by the 9th century, this is happening on a big scale. They're not just looking for loot, they're looking for political conquest and eventually become settlers. So they take over politically, they take over several of these kingdoms, and a large part of what becomes England later becomes under Scandinavian rule. So a lot of English language has got a huge impact of those Scandinavians. So many words we use every day, grammar, words like sky, egg, knife, cake. These are Scandinavian words that come in with these Scandinavian raiders. So they have a huge impact. But if you can have the next slide, please. So this site, this Repton site, was one of those traditional monasteries. This is the mass grave that William talked about. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but in the book, I talk about these forensic methods. When they were excavated, these were really a jumbled up selection of bones. There were artifacts to suggest they were Scandinavian. What we can now do is we can look at them individually. We can study the teeth. We can look at DNA, also something called isotope analysis, because we are like walking diaries of our lives. We have chemical signatures in our bodies. Everything from our teeth, our hair and skin takes up the food and water that we drink and leaves a trace. So where you grew up, so I grew up in Norway, so my teeth have got chemical signatures from my childhood in Norway. The last week, the hair that's growing now on my head will take up the water from India. So the chemical traces will now show that I have traveled. We can do that in the archaeological record as well. And that's giving completely new insights. We now know people came from all over the place, not just single countries in Scandinavia, which is part of the exciting story. So in the book, I can't go into too much detail now. Those are the sort of narratives that I talk about. But then going back to this carnelian bead, so that's all the sort of traditional story. Why do we have this bead? Do we have more signs of this? Was there more of a sort of link between East and West? If we can have the next slide, please. Another new discovery that's come recently is through metal detecting find. Metal detecting is very, very popular in England. And we keep finding these big coins. These are dirhams. These are Islamic dirham coins that end up in the fields in the middle of deepest, darkest Derbyshire, inland England. And we have at the bottom picture is a silver ingot. Vast quantities. Yes, so the coins are from all over the Islamic world, really. They are very carefully dated, so we can see the mint. So they come from places like Baghdad. We've got the dates, we've got the mints, we've got the origins. So they've traveled. The only people bringing them in are the Vikings. But only small numbers of them. We also have these metal pieces, because this silver is being melted down and is used as a key part of the economy. And we can now trace, again, through chemical analysis, that silver back to the Middle East. What that's showing us is actually that what we thought were just a small number of coins is actually silver on a vast scale. So that silver, things like the beads, we now know is ending up in Britain on really quite a big scale. So that's all part of the same system. So all this silver is essentially fueling the Viking Age. If you can have the next slide, please. And what happens really, what's the key here is at the beginning of the Viking Age, we start to see trading settlements. And we might have this image of the Vikings as just these raiding, pillaging Vikings, but actually the trade is a really key part. So what happens right early on, around 750 AD, is around the Baltic Sea, around the countries of Scandinavia, we've got trading settlements popping up. Up to this point, there's no cities, there's no towns in Scandinavia at all. It's very much rural, there's farming communities. But suddenly it sort of springs up on quite a sort of a large scale. So some of the dots on my map here show these settlements. What we now know is that some of these, and some of these in especially the eastern parts of the Baltic Sea especially, actually start earlier on. So they start before the attacks begin in the West. Really know 20 years ago, so this is all new. And they are bringing in many of these exotic goods. So if we can have the next slide, please. Things like this. This is a Buddha statue that comes from one of those trading sites called Birka in Sweden, one of the most famous sites. And is only one of many Eastern objects that turn up.
This is Gandharan originally, isn't it?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
So it's come from Pakistan or Afghanistan all the way to Sweden.
And it's one of these very exotic objects that are clearly being treasured and valued. So these ones, the dirham coins, the beads, there's rock crystal from Sri Lanka as well coming in. And it's coming on a vast scale, and people are using them. They're putting them in graves, in burials. They've turned into jewelry. So dirham coins are being turned into jewelry as well. So people want this connection to the East. It's very visible. And if we go to the next slide, please. What the key here is really those Eastern river routes. So it's the River Volga and the Dnieper. And this map is showing some of those. And what they do is that they essentially create a route down from the Baltic Sea and all the way to the Black Sea. That starts opening up around AD 750. Trade comes up, the silver comes up, and what they're bringing down in return is things like ambers, furs, and also crucially slaves. The slave trade is a really vital part of this. We go to the next slide, please. But this is where it gets interesting, and this is what we'll get back to later on, these Ruse people. So we know about this part from the archaeology, from the objects, but also from some written records. And there's a lot of records of Arabic travelers who go along these rivers, and they describe, so these are essentially ethnographic accounts dating to the 10th century. And this is where we have the stories of human sacrifice and funerals. We're
going to go back to human sacrifice and funeral orgies later.
Yes, we'll get back to that. So this is one of them, most famous from Ibn Fadlan. And they talk about these people, but they're not called Vikings or Scandinavians. Here they are essentially morphed into a new group, the people called the Ruse. So the Ruse appear in the 9th century. We first hear about them actually in what is now was Francia, so now France. And these are people who nobody's quite decided on. And we'll get back to this discussion as well, because it's relevant very much to what's happening in Ukraine now. But these are the people who've got Scandinavian influence. So there certainly are a lot of people from Scandinavia coming, bringing this trade and opening them up. And if you can have the next slide, please. A lot of it, some of it is through the big cities. So cities like Kiev, especially, that becomes the center of this Rus trading networks and becomes the big cities. But also small sites like this. This is a site that I excavated near Chernihiv, which one of those cities that unfortunately now has been under quite severe attacks.
In Ukraine.
In Ukraine, yes, this is northern Ukraine. Nearby, these are little small settlements along the rivers, because the rivers, which is what I got my title of my book for, River Kings, the rivers are the key to this. This is where the transport is going north and south. So what these Rus are doing, these Scandinavians, they're essentially setting up new sort of settlement, new sites where they can control trade, they can take taxes, they can, as one of my Ukrainian colleagues said, harvest slaves, which is a bit of an awful way to think about it, but I think quite realistic. The very name.
And are they using these slaves en route to carry their boats and things?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got some of these records that tell us that they drag the boats from river to river, they carry the goods. So they're quite practical in that sense as well.
So bringing your own mechanic on a road trip.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then you have to keep them fit and healthy as well. So, but the very word slave comes from the Slavic tribes, because this was such a prolific slave trade. And this is going along the river routes, being sort of very tightly controlled. It's helping the expansion of the Kievan state as well. And the main aim, really, the main target's route here, if we can have the next slide, is Byzantium, and it's Constantinople. This city that the Vikings knew as Miklagard. Miklagard basically means the big city, because that's essentially what it was. And this is where the sort of key route of the trade is. So that's the target. We've got some amazing accounts, some of them from Byzantium themselves, of trade treaties. So if you came from Scandinavia to trade, if you're one of these Rus people, you could get free lodgings, you could have 6 months of free baths, you could get food, you could get everything you needed, really, but you had to bring objects down. So this was an incentive for all parts to be involved. But if you go to the next slide, we sort of, the trail goes a bit cold there in terms of the Vikings. So we know Vikings went to Constantinople. We know that some went to the Caspian Sea. There's a lot of raids described in these accounts, the Arabic accounts around the Caspian Sea. We know some went overland to Baghdad. And obviously we've got those coins at the other end coming back to Scandinavia, coming back to Britain. And we got the accounts of the Scandinavians as well coming across. Religion is a really interesting, I'll talk about it in my book as well. If they needed to trade as Christians, they would quite happily say they were Christians. If pagans weren't sort of that popular, they were quite flexible in their approach to religions here. But really, so this is really where the trail goes cold a little bit. I know the bead because we can see the type, the method, types that we come further east. We have no accounts of Scandinavians going to India, but we do know that a lot of goods end up there. In the 10th century, there's an Arabic traveler traveling to what's now Germany, talking about spices, things like ginger and other spices coming to these markets from India. So he's observing these. We know that there are Anglo-Saxons, certainly accounts. Alfred the Great talks about travels and there's other links to India. So
Alfred
there's a knowledge.
Sends monks to Kerala, doesn't he?
He
To
does.
see St. Thomas.
He does, absolutely. So we know there's a link, there's knowledge there, but that's kind of all we know. If you can have the next slide, please. But the sort of final journey, really, so part of my book I talk about as well is these links. So some of my physical journey when I did the research for the book was to travel to Kambat and meet a beadworker. If you go to the next slide, please. This is Anwar Sheikh, just outside Kambat. It took me up to the mines there where these beads have been worked and traded for thousands of years and through the Viking Age. So this is really tapping into those networks that have been in existence, the Silk Road networks that have been in existence for such a long time. Also the Indian Ocean trade, we know that from at least the 9th century, there's these Muslim communities trading along the coast of East Africa. Again, we've got similar trading towns springing up at the same time as in the Baltic. So trade from the 8th century onwards is really flourishing, bringing all these objects and goods backwards. But also what we now know from the bioarchaeology, which I talk about in my book, more sinister things. We now know that disease travels back as well. Just when I was writing this in the pandemic, I was editing the final sections, a new study came up showing that smallpox for the first time arrives in Scandinavia, in Britain, with the Vikings and the Viking Age. And all the links, all the skeletons that we've managed to get this from have these links to the Eastern trade routes as well. So although we have some very positive impacts, we also have essentially early pandemics being brought in at the same time. So there's a bit of give and take there. But yeah, so I think I'm going to end it there. I think there's one more slide, please. Yeah, so I mean, this is small scale, but it's the network that's the key here, and those smaller scale networks along the Silk Roads that really bring us to the end.
So what are these carnelian beads being produced in? They're in Gujarat. This goes back to the Indus Valley. I mean, this is an ancient trade here.
Absolutely. So it's the same material, the same methods, the shapes. So a lot of it, we look at the typology. So we look at the shape of the beads. They become particularly important in this shape in the 9th century. So the earlier beads are quite different. The same beadwork is adapting essentially to the new markets.
And how is it getting and where are the Vikings picking these things up? Are they picking them up in India? Are they probably coming here, or are they getting them in bazaars in Baghdad? Or
I think most likely Baghdad and Constantinople as well.
So
I think those are the big marketplaces.
So Indian traders, maybe from the West Coast, taking stuff from Gujarat to up across the Persian Gulf to Baghdad.
Yeah.
Then the Vikings come all the way down the Caspian Sea and go to Baghdad and buy them there.
Absolutely. So these networks, so we can never tell, that's one of the sort of quite frustrating things in archaeology. We can never tell whether it's objects or people. We certainly know they are there. So I think Baghdad and Constantinople are the sort of key nodal points where all these objects can be traded and swapped and exchanged.
Because the Abbasid trade in Baghdad to India is a hugely important one, isn't it? There's a massive Roman trade with India. Then it goes a bit quiet for a bit.
Yeah.
And Indians look eastwards. And that's the point when, what I'm writing about, when Hinduism and Buddhism suddenly goes from India to Southeast Asia. And then with the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, India starts looking west again. And you get a lot of Indian exports going to, including a lot of cotton from Gujarat, which is the same area that your carnelian bead is coming from, ending up in the Arab world.
Absolutely. So this is it's all part of that same system. And this is really what the Vikings are doing very cleverly, is they're tapping in. So they're creating this back road through Eastern Europe. So these goods can then go back up. So everything from Baghdad, even the silver coins, can go very rapidly. So the dirhams are interesting, the coins, because we have dates on them. So we can say that this is happening within just a couple of years. It's a vast journey. We're talking many, many thousand miles on quite shallow rivers, quite dangerous territory.
Yeah, and presumably if you're carrying a boat, you're quite easy to ambush.
Oh, absolutely.
If you're getting out of one river, pulling
Yeah.
the boat up, getting
Yeah.
your slaves, cracking the whip,
Yeah.
you're completely open to being attacked and enslaved yourself.
Absolutely, and so we know, and there's a lot of tribes, especially in Eastern Europe, there's a lot of steppe tribes, Khazars and people like that who are very much after these traders and the trading goods. So a lot of it, these outposts, so the site that I've worked out, for example, these are sort of protection rackets as well. So these are places where you can travel safely, the locals are protected, the traders are protected. So it's a very cleverly run system on quite a small scale, local scale, but it means that you can get that link to work.
So let's talk about the Rus and the Ukrainians. So
yeah,
there are two different versions of this story, aren't there? There's in a sense the Russian nationalist idea that the Russians were always Slavs and have nothing at all to do with these guys passing up and down the rivers.
Yeah. And
then there's another version of history whereby the Russians are Vikings who stayed behind. Go through that debate a little for us.
Yeah, and it's been very political, and especially under the Soviet Union, that was something that's actually led to a lot of this disconnect between the Eastern and Western Viking world, because the communication between scholarship has been very difficult.
The Russians denied that they were Scandinavians or Vikings at all.
Absolutely, because that was not seen as beneficial. And a lot of it boils down to what's known as the Russian Primary Chronicle, or the Tale of Bygone Years, which tells this sort of origin story. It's actually a medieval document, but it goes back to the 9th century, and it says
like the debates that we have here, but about how historical or not the Mahabharata was.
Right. Yeah.
So, some archaeologists like Bibi Lal are longing to see exactly the events of the Mahabharata put into archaeological layering.
Yeah.
Others say it's more complicated than that.
Yeah, so this is a similar sort of story, because it tells the story that in the 9th century, it says that the Slavic tribes were completely unable to rule over themselves. They were just always fighting each other. And so they had to put a call out to other people to say, come in and rule over us. Our land is great, but we can't look after it ourselves. Put this call out. These people called the Ruse. So this is the origin of the Rurik dynasty. These three brothers came from the north, essentially from Scandinavia, agreed to take over all the lands of the Slavs. And they then set up this Ruse, essentially, territory and kingdom.
Based in Moscow?
No, so Moscow doesn't even exist. So that doesn't really exist in about the 12th century. So it becomes probably Kiev. Kiev is one of the earliest.
Kiev, sorry, we were all learned to call it Kiev.
To go with the Ukrainian pronunciation. So Kiev starts in about 9th century. It's a Slavic town initially, but then the Rus come in. So it's clear that they do come from Scandinavia. We've got another account from the 9th century from Francia, where we hear about these Rus, where they explain that they are from the Swedes. But then very quickly they become established. They have towns. Kiev rises very quickly. So by the 10th century, that's well established. But other towns like Novgorod, for example, settling later on, but is being ruled as a satellite from Kiev. So Kiev's the center of it all. Chernihiv is another one that becomes important as well. But then, how much of this is the Scandinavian impact? We just don't know. So the archaeology is actually starting to tell us more, but it's only really because it was very much denied. One of the sites I worked on, Shestovice, in I think the 1950s or 60s, someone from Moscow sent the archaeologists down to show that there was no Scandinavian impact at all. So they excavated all these grave
despite the fact that the Chronicle explicitly says that there was Scandinavian.
Absolutely.
So the Russian version of events is directly going against the main textual primary source.
It is, but it's there's a few points in there where it can be a little bit ambiguous. They're using that, but also they're then using the later. There's no Ruse state really at all. There's various smaller states. The other claim that I know Putin is using is that we are the same people, and Ukrainian essentially are Russians.
And if you had to sort of take a scholarly middle path here and try and leaving politics aside. How far the Rus are presumably, you have the Vikings setting up river settlements where you're finding more carnelian beads, incidentally, from Gujarat in Ukraine. So the Ukrainian students stuck in Kiev and in Ukraine today are not the first things from India. There was Indian goods and possibly Indian people in Kiev in the 9th century. Yeah, so we've only matching completely identical beads in these settlements as well. So it's such a key part of that trading route. And it's not very far up from Constantinople. This is the Gujarat model gone crazy. Indian exports already in Kiev in the 9th century. This is fantastic. Absolutely. And before we've only got 5 minutes more, but so we have to ask you about two things. First of all, funeral orgies. Tell us about Viking funeral orgies.
So this, if you remember,
there aren't nearly enough funeral orgies in the world today.
No, I don't think so. So the image you might remember earlier of the ship burial. So this is one of those Arabic accounts. So one of the Arabic travelers called Ibn Fadlan traveled along the Volga, and he encountered these people called the Ruse, and he describes them very carefully.
And he says they're very good looking.
Yeah, they're very beautiful. They're the tallest, most, I think he says, most beautiful specimens he's ever seen. They're tall and they're blue-eyed, covered in tattoos as well. So which is why the sort of Netflix Viking series got their idea from. But he is there when one of the chieftains dies. So he is allowed to observe this whole funeral rite and has some amazing parallels in the archaeological record that we have from Scandinavia as well. There's a ship burial, the chieftain dies, but there's a 10-day party essentially leading up to it. And this, for this, a slave girl is asked to sacrifice herself. So they go around and say who would be sacrificed to become chieftain's wife in death. So one of the girls, one of the women, young women, volunteers for this.
Presumably not optionally.
Well, so there's a lot of discussion on this. I mean, usually that's a sort of thought not, but actually, if you look at what that means for her, so she's being treated essentially like a queen for the next 10 days. And in death, her status is elevated to the chieftain's wife. And if you think of a world where the border between life and death is different from ours, this is just a continuation. So actually, this is quite a good deal for her. But the process is quite harrowing. So, but she's being treated very well for 10 years. She gets jewelry, she gets plied with alcohol and food and drink. But she's then asked to go and have sex with all the chieftain's men who say...
Netflix has actually toned it down.
It's very much
when we
from
see
the
these
story.
Netflix robs, they're not sort of hyped up. They're the bowdlerized version of what actually happened.
They come from these records. So this is clearly a very key part of the whole process. Eventually, she does get murdered by somebody called the Angel of Death, who's an elderly woman. So this is the witch character. And then
Fabulous.
taken, and the whole boat is set alight at the end by a man who's naked, and he lights it, and then he walks backwards, holding his hand, covering his anus as he's walking away from the fire. Again, these details, we don't quite know why. But,
this is the Arab account, firsthand,
yeah.
something he's actually seen.
It is.
And so from that to a cleaner subject, the Buddha.
Yeah.
So what's the Gandharan Buddha doing in Sweden? Was anyone worshipping it? Have we got sort of proto-hippie sort of Dharma bums sitting in Gotland at this time, or what's going on?
It's a really good question, and I'm not sure we can ever answer it confidently. It actually had a string around it, a long string wrapped around its neck. So it looked like carried around somebody's neck, which I think is quite a key point. It's an ornament, but it is quite large. So
if you think of those early Anglo-Saxon crosses, you have monks with Bibles around their necks and crosses around their necks. So
I think we need to consider the possibility that this is a religious symbol and that the knowledge is there. We sort of assume, obviously, Buddhism isn't taken up in Scandinavia at all, but that doesn't mean that we don't have people who understand the symbol, understand what it means. We obviously have the Muslim symbols on the coins, and there's various rings, there's other objects with inscriptions relating to Islam in Scandinavia. So the question is, could we maybe have all these religions? We don't know.
We've got time for a couple of minutes of questions from the audience. Any microphones out there? Hands. No more questions on funeral orgies.
That's that much we can say, isn't it?
We'll get taken off with we'll take it off YouTube. There we go.
Hi. If you were to take a scholarly guess, would you say that the name Russia for that region then comes from the Ruses?
Yes, so it does come from that origin. So the Rus being the Rusians, becoming the Russians, basically, which is why there is a lot of sort of different interpretations of what that actually means and why Putin will use it and say, well, look, we are all Rus, but we are the Russians. So it is the names and the words have got a big role to play in that whole debate.
Could some of the trade have gone via the Silk Route, something that William is writing about, the Amu Darya and the Oxus rivers?
It's possible, but we don't know. We don't have the archaeological evidence for it. We have the archaeological evidence along those eastern rivers. But I mean, that's not to say that it's not a possibility.
Hi, would you say that our bones, hair, they are like passports, which you said, that now that I'm in India, a part of the Indian, essence is there in your hair and your bones. And will it last for the next 50 years or 70 years that you're alive? And even after you are no more?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. I probably won't have time to explain it completely, but basically all the cells in our body are taking up those building blocks. So your hair grows a centimeter every month. So if I was here for a month, I would have a centimeter of Indian chemical signatures in my hair. So as long as that hair survives, that will be there. So if hair survived for 1,000 years, then you could look at those same signatures. Yeah, so in mummies, for example, from Egypt, you do get that. But everything else keeps on changing. So when I go back, so my bones and my skin will also take up now, Indian drinking water or whatever, but it will change again when I go back. But my teeth, the enamel on my teeth was formed in my childhood, and your teeth will never change. So your enamel is the same. So your enamel will always reflect your childhood, wherever you were. So William, having lived in India, so his skin, hair, bones will all be Indian, but teeth will have his childhood symbols from Britain. Yeah. So for example, in Repton, there's two graves side by side, two men buried together, and I analyzed their teeth. They had Viking objects and artifacts. What their teeth could show was that they were actually from Denmark. So they came from Scandinavia to England. They couldn't be local at all. We also see differences between men and women, which is really interesting. So we can now, for the first time, start talking about migration among women. We used to think all the women in the Viking Age stayed at home and the men went out to raid. We now know that's not true. Women, we can see this from the teeth, the chemical signals in the teeth.
So there's one more thing I want to ask. Does the Silk Road mean the Silk Route, or does it have a different connotation?
Yeah, no, it's the same thing. So the Silk Route, so all those same networks, same thing.
And there's one more thing, that the Vikings came till Ukraine, but they did not cross over to the Indian subcontinent as such, because, after many years or centuries, maybe, they kept looking for a route to India, but they did not look for that route at that time. They met at a common point, but they do not go further and look for India.
They definitely get to Constantinople.
Yeah, so they go to Constantinople, they go to Baghdad.
There's a huge regiment of Viking soldiers fighting for the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, and Viking graffiti in Hagia Sophia.
Yeah, absolutely. So they go these ways. We know they go to Baghdad. I think part of the problem, you can't take your boats as easily the way to the Indian Ocean. So maybe that's part of the problem.
Baghdad has a vast Indian trading diaspora. So it's probably, the idea is it's probably Baghdad, where these beads, one lot are bringing beads from Gujarat, and then they're meeting the Vikings who've come on their boats.
So I think they get what they need there. They don't need to go further east because they get everything they want.
Thank you very, very much. Cat, both Cat and I will be signing our books in the author's signing tent now. I cannot recommend a history book more than I recommend this, but it is a wonderful, wonderful tour de force of serious academic new research that changes the subject, but written in, as you've seen, the most gripping and exciting way. It's in many ways the perfect archaeology book. So please line up and buy a copy of River Kings. You will not be disappointed.
Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Cat Jarman in conversation with William Dalrymple. They'll be available right at that cute yellow tent behind you. That's the book signing area for Front Lawn. And therefore, we also extend our heartfelt gratitude to Cat Jarman, William Dalrymple, and Hawthornden Literary Retreat. We also present them with a small token of our love and appreciation. And just a reminder, yet again, you have your yellow seats. There's the cute yellow tent. The cute yellow tent is for the author book signing area for Front Lawn. So if you want to get your amazing book signed, that's your spot.
Where do we go?
Ladies and gentlemen,